Casey Tanner, so nice to see you. Licensed therapist, a global thought leader, author, founder and CEO of the Expansive Group, and first-time author of the book, Feel It All, a therapist's guide to reimagining your relationship with sex. How are you?
I'm so good. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so first book, but lots of advice that you give every single day. How are you feeling right now?
Yeah, I'm feeling a little bit anxious, a little bit uncertain, but really, really excited. This has been now 3 years in the making. So I feel like I am birthing a child and I finally get to really meet them.
I feel like that's what everybody says. I completely agree with you. Talk a little bit about your background, though. Your background is very interesting because I think that really speaks to why and how you're writing your book.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you had asked me 10 years ago what book I would have written, it would have been an evangelical Christian book about purity culture. So obviously my life has taken a huge shift. I went to school to become a pastor. At some point in reckoning with my own mental health, realized that I was queer, realized that my life depended on being more open about my sexuality. Through that process, became a sex therapist, and really I'm sort of a different kind of evangelical now, right? Like going out and spreading the word about sex positivity and sexual self-care.
We talk a lot about sex when it comes to midlife and in menopause, and I speak a lot to perimenopause and menopause, and it really does play a big role in our lives and something that we have not felt comfortable, I think until kind of recently, to even bring up and talk about, especially to normalize.
Well, I think that we've all been given the message that your sexual awakening happens when you're in your late teens and early 20s, and then you're done. And then from there, it's all downhill. And that's just not what the research says. That's not what the people I talk to say. We know that many of us are having sexual awakenings into our 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond.
I think that's so interesting, and you're right about that. And I think especially during this time in midlife, that's what we think. We think like, it's all over. We don't look sexy, feel sexy, act sexy, or want to have sex. And I'm seeing something very, very different out there.
Yeah, that's just absolutely not true. And the thing that makes sex great is knowing how to talk about it, knowing how to communicate about what works for your bodies. When I was 18 years old, I did not know what worked for my body. I would never go back to the sex that I was having 15 years ago. And I think a lot of people that are in midlife feel the same way.
How do you start creating some of those pathways to healing?
I, of course, am biased, but I think making sure that you're sitting with a therapist who is comfortable talking about sex. You would be surprised how many therapists have never taken a single course about talking about sexuality. And that's no shade to therapists, that's shade to the education system that doesn't believe that sex is important. So make sure that you have at least one person in your life that you're comfortable talking about sex with. Because when I think about the harm done to all of us around our sex miseducation, yes, it happened in schools, but a lot of that happened in relationships. We look to our peers, our parents, our siblings to teach us about sex. Right. And so when it comes to relearning and unlearning later in life, I think the best way to do that is through relationships. And it doesn't have to be through sexual relationships. I mean, how many people get married and are in relationships and then stop talking openly about sex with their friends? It's a huge disservice we do to ourselves. So just start talking about sex, and it doesn't even need to be with somebody that you're sleeping with.
Well, I think that's such a good point. And I think that, when we talk about it outside of those relationships, it's easier to bring it inside. So how do you create that stronger relationship with your partner? I know that there's tips and tricks, but I really think at the core of it, it's communication.
Yes. So many people say there's something I want to be different about my sex life. How do I tell my partner that? And like with anything that we're giving partners feedback around, if the only time we're coming to them to give them feedback is to talk about something negative, then all of us will feel really, really anxious anytime sex enters the room. So I always recommend creating a ritual around checking in about sex, whether that's debriefing sex right after it happens or checking in once a month for 30 minutes about how your intimate life is feeling. Having that predictable check-in on the table lowers anxiety because suddenly you're not just talking about sex when it's going wrong. You're talking about it when it's neutral. You're talking about it when it's going really well.
You talk about some different dating red flags. I think that's important. We didn't get a manual to learn how to date right, to have sex right, to have relationships right. What do you suggest for people out there? Because dating is very different than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
Yeah, in a way, dating is much, much easier because there's all of this availability and accessibility. But I think in the same way, it becomes so much harder because we're flooded with choices. And when we're flooded with choices, we have to make, split second decisions about who we are interested in spending our time with. That's where I think these red flags come in. I think it is really, really hard in our guts to distinguish between something that makes us anxious and is a little bit scary and something that's a red flag, because those are actually two different things. something that might make us feel really anxious in dating might actually be really good for us. It might mean we're trying something new. It might mean we're breaking a pattern. So I would suggest that people sit down again with themselves, with a therapist, with a journal, and really ask, what are the things that I have been thinking about as red flags? Could some of those things actually just be things that I'm a little bit afraid of and are worth looking at? We are drawn in relationships to things that are familiar. That's why so many people joke about ending up with their dad or ending up with their mom, right? The only way to not do that is to do something different. And that's scary.
A lot of people are on these dating apps, and I feel like sometimes they're trying to impress the person that they're trying to attract versus be the person that they are. And I think that those are things that can be quite the struggle. So what do you recommend to people?
In between my stint as trying to become a pastor and becoming a sex therapist, I did advertising for a little while. So this is a tip that actually comes from that moment, which is it's okay to have a niche. Have a niche and own it. Be somebody that is unpalatable to the large majority of the population, because that's the way you're going to find your person. No one benefits from having hundreds of people being into them, right? People benefit from having their partner or group of partners that are into them. And in order to narrow folks down, you have to allow yourself to be weird and interesting and quirky. That is the best way to not waste your energy on a dating app.
And yourself.
And
that's the most important.
And yourself,
people
right?
Look at other things, and they copy the same verbiage, and it has nothing to do with who they are. What would you like people to take away from your book?
I want people to have a sexual awakening or a sexual reawakening wherever they are, whoever they are. And what I want to make really clear about this is that it's not a sexual awakening that is about having more sex, because I think for a lot of us, our sexual awakenings will involve less quantity and more quality, right? And sexual awakenings look different for every single person. I think a lot of us think about an awakening as happening, overlooking the ocean on a yoga mat in a meditative position. And I'm like, no, this is a middle of the day at the grocery store, middle of your commute, because it really requires us to get in touch with our feelings and our pasts and our pain. I don't think that sex can be separated out from all of the other things going on in our lives. And so I'm inviting folks to take a look at that.
Is that a hard process or a hard healing process for people to go through?
Oh, yeah. I mean, and it definitely can get harder before it gets easier. There's a reason that we have been avoiding this in ourselves. And that's because there are parts of us that are trying to protect us from looking at things that are really hard and painful. So in order to really invite a sexual awakening, we have to be ready to look in the mirror and have the support systems to do that. It can be triggering. It can bring back memories that are really painful, even traumatic, but it is necessary.
People have to have the right therapist for them, right? They have to find somebody that they feel comfortable opening up to, feel that understands them. How do you go about finding the right therapist?
I think that we don't need to go out and find a therapist that looks and sounds and talks exactly like us. But I do think going and knowing the identities that you have and finding somebody that can mirror the language that you use for yourself. So for example, if you're a Black, Indigenous person of color, looking for somebody that shares that identity. As a queer person, it's important for me to find a queer therapist. If you're somebody exploring your sexuality later in life, you might not want to see a therapist that's 26 years old, right? It's not because that person can't help per se, but sometimes just lowering the barrier by starting out speaking the same language can be really helpful for folks. Psychology Today is a great resource. AASECT, AASECT.com is a great place to find certified sex therapists who specifically have trained around these topics.
Casey, thank you so much. It's so good talking to you.
Yeah, this was awesome. Really appreciate you.
All right, we'll see you soon.